This week, I have been thinking in metaphors, which, as an amateur poet, professional writer, and a former English teacher, I love. I love metaphors because they give us a new lens to look at familiar things. And there are many famous metaphors out there. From Shakespeare, all the world's a stage, and the men and women merely players, to Jesus, who used many metaphors to describe himself. I am the bread of life. Whoever eats this bread will not hunger. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Writers and teachers and preachers, we love a good metaphor. And this week, Marge and Kristen and Esther and I attended the College of Congregational Development, and we spent hours and hours every day immersed in models, which are another kind of metaphor. These models were new lenses for how to look at congregational life and leadership so that we can continue growing as a church and as individuals in our faith. It was incredibly fun, deeply meaningful, and wildly exhausting. Models and metaphors encourage us to look through a specific lens and see things in a new way, sometimes with more clarity, sometimes so we can figure out what in the world to do next. And one of the most classic metaphors for a church is family. We hope that when we are at our best, but especially when we are at our worst, that St. Anthony's can be a family. Families are messy and complicated, and sometimes the most beautiful and wonderful thing in the world. Many churches hope to offer their people a chosen family. Not a social club or an activist group or a school, though we may do social activities, community service, and Bible study together, but instead, a family focused on one action, which is following Jesus together. Jesus himself had a strange encounter with his own family in today's gospel. By the time his family shows up, Jesus has already had a pretty busy day. Last week, we heard how he healed a man's hand on the Sabbath and angered the Pharisees. Shortly after that, he encounters a large crowd and begins to heal people of what Mark calls unclean spirits. And when the unclean spirits saw him, they cried out, "You are the Son of God." But the people say, "You are Beelzebub." Tough day for Jesus. Afterwards, he decides among the crowd to choose his 12 disciples, and then finally we arrive to today's scene where Jesus is at someone's house, gathered with another large crowd, and teachers of the law accused him of being a demon in order to cast demons out. Mark reports that Jesus' family had heard these stories circulating and showed up to restrain, is the word our text used, to restrain Jesus. because they thought he had lost it, and they needed to come take responsibility for him. But when Jesus' family arrives at the house where he's gathered with his new disciples, they send a messenger into the house to let Jesus know they'd arrived. The messenger says, "Teacher, your mother and your brothers are outside looking for you." To this, Jesus, of course, asks a question, as he so often does. Who is my mother and my brothers? And after what I imagine was a long pause, he answers his own question, gestures to the people all around him. Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and mother and sister. My family, another metaphor. What in the world do we learn from Jesus here? Is he rejecting his birth family? Or is he expanding the definition of family? Mark doesn't describe whether Jesus actually goes out to talk to his siblings and mother, so we don't know exactly what happened between them. We just know he continued to minister in his hometown and that he had a rough time doing it. And I remember as a little girl hearing this story and feeling bothered. Why wouldn't he go out and talk to his family? So I've often pictured he probably did, but what might he say? We don't know. The Gospel of Mark is probably the oldest gospel, and it is the shortest. Mark doesn't have any stories about Jesus' birth or stories about Jesus as a little boy. We don't have a charming nativity scene. Mark jumps straight into business and focuses on telling the story of Jesus' ministry. He's a little less concerned with painting Jesus' life from childhood on and more concerned with writing down what Jesus is teaching. And this feels like a teaching moment, this conversation. Who is my family? Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. What Jesus is describing to me sounds like church. At church, this one or any other church, people gather together in order to learn and try to discern God's will so that they may follow it together. At St. Anthony's, our mission is gather, grow, and go. And at the College of Congregational Development, they switch it a little bit and they call it gather, transform, and send. And that is another model we learned about. Any church hopes to gather people together in many different ways, give them opportunities to experience transformation as individuals and as a community, and then send them out into the world to tell people the good news of God's love for all people. This action is what unifies us. As Jesus said, those who do the will of God are my family. But here's the thing, and I don't know about you, but my family, sorry, Mom, if you're watching, my family is messy sometimes. We don't always agree. And sometimes the people we love and trust the most are also the people who manage to hurt us the most. Sometimes families have trouble communicating with one another and get caught up in silly things. Or sometimes in a family, you might disagree about the crucial things, the big things. We might disagree with people we really, really love about issues that feel so close to our heart. And if you've ever had a disagreement like that with someone in your family, I think you can imagine and picture how much it hurts. And if church is a family where we try to follow God's will together, it might happen here too sometimes. Another metaphor of church is that it's a hospital. All of us need to be here. We're all human. And if church is a family, and occasionally we have conflict or disagreements, I think that means we are doing something right. And here's why. If everyone in our church had exactly the same beliefs, habits, hobbies, standards, it would be really boring. If we all agreed on the issues, the little ones and the big ones, we wouldn't really be a family, we'd be a club. Don't get me wrong, clubs are great, but families are bound together by something bigger. Families talk to each other and argue with one another, and when the family system is healthy, They forgive each other and stay in relationship, even in the midst of differences, and even when those differences feel really important. Sometimes the person you disagree with about the important thing could be me, and that is okay, even good. We can learn from each other. Jesus could have said, "Those who share my blood are my family. Those who agree with me are my family. Those who vote like me, or dress like me, or love like me, or look like me, or believe exactly like me are my family." But he didn't say that. He said, "Those who do the will of God are my family." And that's what we hope to do here at church, in this community. The family way of being church is a hard way. It is harder than the club way. It is much easier and simpler and more convenient to do church together when everyone agrees on all the hot topics and everyone works together smoothly and gets along. But when we are different and still love and respect each other, when we disagree but still talk and stay in relationship, when we let someone down, apologize, and reconcile, when we mess up and can laugh about it, and especially when we always return our focus to doing the will of God together, then, my siblings in Christ, we have truly been a family. May it be so.